Oh, hi there, guys. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about this new MRP poll that's just come out this week. Before I get into the numbers, I'd be extremely grateful if you could subscribe and like the video if you find what I talk about interesting. Just helps me to grow the channel. So thanks a lot. In UK politics, 326 is the threshold that you need for a majority government. According to these numbers, Reform and the Tories are looking at 317, and then a sort of rainbow coalition of left parties or vaguely left parties, including Labour, the Lib Dems, SNP, the Greens, and Plaid Cymru. But that only gets 311 votes. Again, the way it works in UK politics, as the incumbent, Labour would get the first chance to form a government. At best, they might be able to sort of form a minority government with, all those other parties, sort of with the sole purpose of pushing through legislation for a change in the electoral system to PR, and then perhaps call another election. But that would be about it, really. It's really interesting times that we live in. I thought it was obviously we're 4 years out from an election, so you can't read too much into it. But it's just a fascinating insight into how sort of fragmented and divided British politics is at the moment. So as well this week, the British Social Attitude Survey was also released. Now, John Curtis, he's the elections guy, if you remember, and you've seen him on the TV. So he made the point this week that class is no longer the dividing line between, or the main dividing line in British politics, and that age and education are now the major dividing lines. So this MRP poll sort of bears that out really entirely. If you look at this MRP poll in that context, so you see the spread of seats that Labour have got. They're essentially reduced to a rump of seats in almost exclusively urban areas. So what you're going to have is Labour, predominantly going to be made up of young people, graduates, maybe people who work in the public sector, people of colour, and that's going to be their voter base. And then you'll have the Green Party sort of nipping at their heels in those areas. In terms of reform, they're taking seats all over the industrial areas in the north, the old industrial areas in the north and the Midlands, plus areas in Wales and the southeast. And their voter base obviously is going to be, generally speaking, going to be older, majority white people, perhaps without a university education, maybe homeowners, probably socially conservative in their outlook, maybe people who are anti-immigrant, feeling left behind by globalization. And then you've got the Lib Dems and the Tories fighting it out for the farmers and the stockbrokers in the Shires and the Southwest, and then the SNP in Scotland. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the wider politics of it all, really. Although reform are sort of riding high, and people, particularly on the left, are worried about, perhaps a reform government coming in after this Labour government. Personally, I'm not convinced by that. I think we may be seeing the high watermark for reform currently. I don't know how you guys feel. I personally feel like I've seen nothing other than reform on the media, on the TV over the course of the last year. But in terms of first past the post, like their vote share is actually quite poor. They're currently polling at about 30%. But for context, in 2019, Boris Johnson and the Tories got almost 44%. And during the vaccine bounce, they were polling at around 50%. So despite all that positive press and sort of lack of scrutiny they get, Nigel Farage really, he's never been popular in this country. He tried and failed to become an MP 7 times. Brexit's been a disaster. And what has he really got? He's got a TikTok account and his own TV station. Now, obviously, that can take you quite a long way, but I don't see anything in his policy platform that says they're going to win over the sort of numbers needed to get an outright majority. And I don't get the sense that support for reform is organic. It feels to me like it's entirely driven by their sort of media presence and their lack of scrutiny within the media. So for people who get their information from GB News or who watch the TV, of course they think reform are great because that's all they're hearing and seeing every day. And then on the other side of it, obviously you've got to think Labour have been absolutely awful this in their first year. But I don't see it being a total disaster because nearer the election, they're probably, they're going to start to engage in what's called, pork barrel politics. So they'll start to throw policies towards their supporters, and it's highly likely that with lower interest rates there will be a bit more growth, and people might start feeling slightly better off. And they could also then get rid of Starmer and Reeves, which would obviously give them a huge boost in popularity. But I think the wider point is that there's not one party that's sort of riding high. Nobody's really enamoured with any of the main political parties, and even Reform are not performing that well. So it feels like it's this is a bit of two fingers up from the British electorate to say, buck your ideas up basically to our political class. And yeah, I'm not sure they've got it in them, to be honest, but that's a different topic. But yeah, thanks a lot, guys. See you next time.